All right, now that you've watched the video, let's go through these examples. So, which of these is going to be counted in gross domestic product? In order to be counted, it has to be a final good or service produced within the calendar year of the calculation, and it has to be sold to a consumer. So the government has to be able to observe this sale. So a visit to a doctor would count. Sale of a used car would not count because the car was not produced within the time period we're measuring. Vacuuming your rug at home would also not count because there's no sale. There's nothing that has been exchanged between a producer and a consumer. Now, this activity is productive. So we call this kind of an activity household production. And this is actually one of the limitations of GDP, that we can't include household production. So when you vacuum your rug at home, doesn't count towards GDP, but if you hire a cleaning service to come vacuum your rug, it would count towards GDP. And so in some sense, just because the government can't observe household production, it can't be included in GDP. Ideally, we would like to include it because those productive activities are part of our aggregate production. All right, burrito, definitely gonna count. Haircut will count. Cheese from Italy will not count because we're measuring US GDP, but jeans from Kentucky will count. Right? So now we're kind of getting a sense of what types of things go into our GDP calculation and what types of things are left out. But what does it matter? Why do we care about aggregate production? Well, we care about aggregate production primarily because we care about aggregate income. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to understand when we are measuring what's going on in the economy is what is the reality in terms of standard of living or quality of life for people in a country, in a state, in a city. That's what we're trying to get at here. And so because aggregate production is equal to aggregate income, then this measure gives us some sense of the quality of life of people living in a certain area. When we have a lot of production, we're producing a lot of stuff, that stuff has value, okay? People are gonna sell that stuff. And in the aggregate, okay, total expenditures is equal to total income. So everything that's being sold has a buyer and a seller. And so aggregate expenditures, total expenditures is going to be equal to total income. So what we really care about when we're measuring aggregate production is to try to get some sense of not just how much is being produced in this country, but how much is being created, how much value is being created, because that gives us a sense of how much we can consume. All right, so GDP is an imperfect measure of aggregate production, certainly, and therefore an imperfect measure of aggregate income for a lot of different reasons. Because there's a lot of things that don't get included in GDP. One of them we've mentioned already, and that's household production. Right? So you maybe cook dinner for yourself. Great. That value of that productive activity is not included in GDP. So the GDP numbers are going to underestimate the value of our production, particularly in cases where we have a lot of people working at home, right, taking care of children or elderly parents. When we have a lot of people working in the informal sector, right, under the radar, right? And in some countries, we have large informal sectors of the economy, and that's going to affect their GDP numbers. So it's important to recognize that we can't include in GDP anything that we don't observe, that the government doesn't observe. not included in GDP as well are other things that have value to us, like environmental production. Yeah. And that means that GDP doesn't reflect, right, all of the things that we value. So GDP is a really limited measure, not only of aggregate production, but of well-being as a whole. And so we have lots of different ways to measure well-being, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the discussion about long-run economic growth. But for right now, I just want to point out, right, that there are a lot of things we care about that are not measured by GDP. And even some types of production that aren't going to be reflected in those numbers. All right, so what we're going to do now is to do an example using what's called the expenditures method. And this is actually not going to be our main focus of calculating GDP, but I think it's useful here at the beginning for two reasons. First, you're going to be introduced here to our national income identity. Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, and we're going to be using that, returning to this just as a concept, as an idea in future topics. So I'm going to introduce you here to the national income identity, and then the second reason I want to use this expenditures method is, again, just to try to reinforce what gets included in GDP and what's not included in GDP. All right, so let's start with the national income identity. So here, Y is output. Y is output. That's what we're trying to measure. What is the aggregate level of output or aggregate production in our economy? And in this method, what we're going to do to calculate aggregate output is we're going to think about expenditures, because remember, everything that is produced and sold creates income for someone and spending for someone else. So if we go through the economy and we add up all of our expenditures in a time period, that would be equal to all of our income, and that would be a reflection of aggregate production. So here, we're going to go through and think about different categories of spending, and this is really just totally conceptual, right? We're going to think about what are all the different ways that people or groups within our economy are spending money on goods that are being produced in the US, in our country. So C represents consumer spending, okay? I stands for investment, which is business expenditures. So we have expenditures by consumers, expenditures by businesses. G is government expenditures. Just thinking about kind of all of the different groups here that can spend money. And then the last term is net exports, which is, so that stands for net exports, which is exports minus imports. So who can spend money on stuff we produce? Consumers, businesses, the government, and people in other countries. Okay, that's it. That's our national income identity. Now, you'll notice here that we are subtracting off imports. And a lot of people get confused by this. Does that mean that if we import a lot of stuff, our GDP is going to go down? No, it does not. Why do we need to subtract off imports? It's because the other categories of spending, consumption, investment, and government spending, they could include things that are produced in other countries, right? If I look at total consumer spending in the United States, some of that spending is going to be on things that were imported. And we don't necessarily want to include that in our GDP calculation because we don't want to include things that weren't produced in the United States. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add up total consumption spending, total investment, total government expenditures, and then we'll just subtract off the part that was spent on imports. That does not mean that importing products is going to reduce our GDP. If anything, what you know about international trade is that specialization and trade will enable us to produce more. It expands our production possibilities, right? So that's a common misperception here. We do subtract off imports in our national income identity. That does not mean that imports are bad for domestic production. Okay. All right, so let's go through this example now. I've got here kind of a table with just some random numbers that represent some theoretical expenditures. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through and categorize them as C, I, G, net exports, or not included in GDP. And then we'll add them all up to get our aggregate expenditures, which is our measure of aggregate production. Okay, so the first one is really easy, right? Consumption expenditures should go into C. Exports, also pretty easy, that goes in net exports. Government purchases of goods and services will be government spending. Okay. Now, the next couple are a little bit more tricky. So, construction of new homes. Now, these homes are not necessarily sold. A lot of times it takes a lot of time for homes to be built and then for those homes to be sold. So this is just construction of new homes, and this is going to go into I, investment spending. Okay, anytime we produce a product but it hasn't been sold yet, okay, or we're investing in our production process, that's going to go into investment spending. Sales of existing homes. Sales of existing homes does not count towards GDP. Remember, what we're trying to do is to measure everything that's being produced in this time period. And if I just transfer a home, somebody owns it, now somebody else owns it, I have not produced anything, right? Same with a car, right? You have a car, you sell it to someone else, nothing new has been produced, nothing new has been created, and that will not count towards GDP. All right, imports, it's gonna go into net exports. The next one is a tricky one. Beginning of the year inventory and end of the year inventory. This is how we think about changes in investment over time, right? We start out with some number of goods at the beginning of the year. Now we've added some more to that. We've invested, right, in our business. We've accumulated inventory. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put both of these into investment, but only the difference, right, is going to count towards GDP. So we're going to do end of the year inventory minus beginning of the year inventory to show how much investment spending we had to increase our inventory during this time period. And say we had a decrease in inventory, that's okay. That negative number would go into our GDP calculations because some of our consumption expenditures would have been on stuff that was already in our inventory in the beginning of the year. So we would want to subtract that off. All right. Business fixed investments, also going to count towards investment spending. Government payments towards retirees, not going to count. Nope, not at all, right? Because here what we have is a transfer. Again, a transfer of assets from one person to another. The government takes in tax revenue, and then they use some of that tax revenue to build roads and schools. That's spending on goods and services. That will count towards GDP. But they use some of that revenue to give to people who are retired, right? We have Social Security payments. So they mail a check to your grandma. That is not going to count towards GDP because nothing new has been produced. We've simply taken money that used to belong to a worker, we've given it to the government, and the government has given it to a retiree. So this does not count towards GDP. It's just a transfer of assets from one party to another. All right, and the last one, going to go in consumption expenditures. And you'll notice here that we've broken out these durable goods, which is actually an important measure of what's going on in the economy unto itself. We look at durable good expenditures because it gives us some sense of consumer confidence. Durable goods are products that last a really long time, like a washing machine or a car or a refrigerator. So you only buy it once every 20 years, maybe if you're lucky. All right, so why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because these are purchases that are easy to postpone. And so if you're nervous about the economy, you're not going to run out and buy all new appliances or buy a new car. You'll just stick with the one you have a little bit longer. So household purchases of durable goods gives us some sense about consumer confidence in the economy, which is in and of itself an important measure of what's going on in the economy. All right, so the last step here is to add everything up. We've got C, all right, we've got I, that's 250. We've got G, and we've got net exports. And total, that gives me Y, which is total expenditures, which is our measure here of aggregate income and aggregate production. All right, on the next page, we're going to go through an example calculating real and nominal GDP using a much different method. So I'll see you in the next video for that.